Nice.
This is yours. Okay, great.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a really good turnout, so happy to have you all here. My name is Kaylee Richardson. I'm the director of the Dikeou Collection. For those of you who haven't been here before, this space is home to a private collection of contemporary art that's free and open to the public Wednesday through Friday by appointment, as well as for special events like we're having here tonight. If you signed in our sign-in sheet when you entered today, then you'll be put on our email list and you'll get updates about more events that we do here. So hopefully we'll get to see some of you again in the future. The exhibition that we have on view is artist Dikeou. She is the co-founder and curator of the Dikeou Collection, and this is her mid-career retrospective. So all the work on view is by her, spanning the beginning of her career in the 1980s up through present day. She's from Denver, but is currently based in New York. So for our event tonight, we are pleased to welcome author Thomas Beller and Denver Nuggets beat writer for the Denver Post, Mike Singer. Mike joined the newspaper in 2018 after serving as the national NBA editor at USA Today. A Cleveland native, he previously covered the Chicago Bulls for CSNChicago.com and worked at CBSSports.com. He is also a proud Wisconsin Badger. Thomas Beller is Associate Professor of English at Tulane University, a regular contributor to The New Yorker, and the author of J.D. Salinger, The Escape Artist, How to Be a Man, Seduction Theory, and other books. One of those other books is Open City, which was a literary and visual art journal founded by Beller and Daniel Fitchbeck in the 1990s. Dikeou, who I was just speaking about, published projects in issues number 1 and number 10. So Devin and Tom go way back. Unfortunately, she cannot be here tonight, but she prepared an introduction, which I will share with you all now. So these are Devin's words. Vessel, the word. I somehow pull it from my mental card catalog of synonyms. Vessel, a synonym for bowl. Tom is writing the equivalent of choices for the art section of 7 Days, the soon-to-be defunct competitor of the Village Voice. He's really got a strangely particular amount of power in the small art world at hand, when analog choices, suggestions change the day, in print. Now, 35 years later, we are here, and Tom is writing about a different kind of art. He calls it poetry, basketball. As opposed to the military aspect of football and the religiosity of baseball. And poetry, by its very nature, contains. It contains energy, emotion, and all the unmentionables that are the mentionable we all want to know. Bring on that vessel, fill it with that game, that art, that poetry. We all want to sit out of that vessel. So now I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thank you. Thanks, Haley. Thank you guys for being here. Thank Mike Singer. Thank you, the Dikeou Collection, for the gift of this wild, Borgesian, labyrinthine exhibit with all of these strange echoes of time and place floating around, not least of which is that crazy introduction that mentions the Village Voice and this one-time competitor called 7 Days, for which I did this bizarre column, which I will just elaborate on briefly because I haven't thought about it for 30 years, but it used to be there was a law passed in the 80s that art galleries in New York were required to tell you if it was open to the public and they were selling work, they were required to disclose what the cost of the art was. And this was like an anathema to the whole culture of art galleries. They're going to put a stick, what are we, like selling toys? So they didn't want to do it. They went to great lengths to suppress that information, and this subsequently very famous magazine editor named Adam Moss decided that it would be cool to have somebody just go from gallery to gallery like a professional jerk, basically. Like, hey, I was wondering, how much is that? And then when they came back with, well, we're going to discuss it, and I was like, no, but you're supposed to have a number. And just have that little moment at the front desk. C'est moi. And And it's interesting to me because the room we're in, with these bizarre gates to nowhere, has a kiosk. And I recently I write for the New Yorker sometimes, but it's usually online, but I had a piece in the magazine. And I waited till the last day before the next magazine came out. I said, oh, I need to buy a copy of the magazine. This is in Manhattan. I went running around to those structures and discovered that they're completely ersatz. That thing sells no fewer magazines than all the things in New York. They're just selling candy and water and God knows what else. Maybe they've got a few old people magazines for show. It's just interesting. So I don't know, I'm just tying this all together. It has nothing to do with what I'm here to do. Nothing. But it has to do with why I'm here, which is partly this venue, that it's self-available in Devon, but largely it's this subject, which I became interested in a number of years ago at a time in the trajectory, and Mike and I will talk about this, since, by the way, I want to thank you also for attending the first annual symposium for the Institute of Jokic Studies. This is a senior fellow, and I'm sort of ground floor. So when I got interested in Jokic, thought, oh wow, that's a very odd basketball dude. He's doing some strange things, and I recognized certain qualities in him that I could project. Well, I'm not going to say too much because I'm going to read from a portion of this piece, but I just want to say at the time I was like, he was my private little interest. He was an obscure, kind of chubby, ambling guy for a small market NBA team. And I started working on this piece, and it took a really long time, during which he stopped being my private little secret interest. But throughout the work, I was just aided enormously by Mike Singer, who was so generous to talk to me and hear out ideas and share all kinds of interesting tidbits. And as this book came into shape, I thought, I have to come to Denver, convene with the Jokic people, and just mark the occasion. Because I was so involved in Denver that there's a piece in here about Bol Bol, who was also on the team. It just, ancillary energy ended up there. So, without further ado, this is quite a long piece. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read for 15 minutes, a few sections. Then Mike and I are going to chat, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from you. And throughout, we have our sort of, no, he's not a patron saint. That's not the word. We'll figure out his role in this proceeding. Thank you to the Dikeou Collection for having all the foresight, theatrical lighting. This piece is called The Jokic Files, and it's each of the many sections has a title. It begins with Jokic's nose. Nikola Jokic is an NBA basketball player from Sombor, Serbia, whose nose turns the color of a ripe plum after a few minutes of exerting himself on the court. He has a heavy brow that sits low over piercing blue eyes. He often seems to be breathing heavily through his open mouth. His usual expression when on the court doesn't suggest exhaustion so much as a kind of muted confusion and mortification, almost a feeling of embarrassment, as though he is not entirely sure what is happening on the court and what he is supposed to be doing. Although nearly 7 feet tall, his body was, in the early years of his career, flabby. There was none of the muscle definition one associates with professional athletes. The overall effect was that of a large, chubby kid who was in some way overmatched by his situation. Over years of dedicated work on his body, the flab has abated, but the expression remains the same, as does the nose. Organized basketball, let alone professional basketball, is in many ways so strictly choreographed that it is silly compared to the chaos of a playground, yet the same subterranean currents of menace and intimidation run through both. When I first saw Jokic's inflamed-looking nose, I had a visceral sense of a kid on a playground who had been bullied. Not literally punched in the nose, but teased to the point where he had gone off to a corner to grieve and recover, and was now returning to the fray with only the red nose as evidence of his private ordeal. But this is a projection. I am the kid in this description. Jokic's arms. Jokic seems to get scratched on his upper arms more than any other player in the NBA. By the end of each game, his upper arms are covered in claw marks, some deep enough to draw blood. I lead the league in scratches, he told ESPN in 2019, the first year he made the playoffs, in his first year as an all-star. "I'm always bleeding," he said. "I'm used to it." I asked Mishko
Resnatovich.
Rasnatovich, we'll work on that. We have a whole year before our next conference. He'll be a special speaker. I asked one more time.
Mishko Resnatovich.
Him, the Serbian basketball scout who first discovered Jokic, why this arm situation might be. He responded in his customary uppercase email style, quote, "I have no real explanation besides the fact that his skin is very sensitive." Jokic often holds the ball over his head with one hand in a manner that suggests a seal balancing the ball in its nose. From this position, he will shoot the ball or more often pass it. Ben Golliver of the Washington Post calls him Mr. Hypotenuse because his passes often come from above. Sometimes he whips the ball like a pitcher in baseball, though without the windup. Sometimes he cradles the ball like a water polo player. Sometimes the passes are lofted like gentle soap bubbles in the direction no one expected. The effect is like that of a pickpocket. At times he seems to have adopted the movement of Kareem's skyhook and repurposed it for passing. His arms, in other words, are always doing, or often doing, unusual things. Jokic often seems to redirect the ball with a glancing touch. The effect is faintly reminiscent of Dennis Rodman's habit of tipping the ball to himself, except that Rodman was a famously quick jumper who got rebounds, while Jokic famously never leaves the ground. When after years of diligent training with Nuggets strength coach Philippe Eichenberger, he began to dunk, the event was always noted with excitement because of its rarity. Jokic moves slowly but continuously, like a deep-sea creature. He moves with an amphibian's dreamy grace, a kind of lumbering lightness, except for every now and then when the snap of a wrist sends the ball flying in an unexpected direction into the waiting hands of an open teammate. Perhaps he gets scratched because even though he never seems to leave the ground, or because of this fact, his arms are often extended at his shoulders, bent at the elbow in the chicken wing position, ready at all times to extend. In the summer of 2014, before his first NBA season, he made a pilgrimage to work out at the Peak Performance Project P3 sports clinic in Santa Barbara, California. I had several conversations with P3's founder, Marcus Elliott, about this seminal visit, which lasted for 5 weeks. The first day I met him, he said, "My basketball good, my body not so good," Elliott reported. He grabbed his little belly. One doesn't need highly sophisticated computer equipment to observe that Jokic can't jump, but his time at P3 provided a highly detailed set of data to underpin the less observable fact that his feet and his fingertips are connected to an unusual degree. My first conversations with Elliott took place after the start of the pandemic, when he had moved his family to the Alps. My sense of him on a secluded mountaintop in the clear alpine air added to the already prevalent sense I had when talking to him about his lab, of a nearly spiritual quest to get at a simple truth by using complex data. The simple truth of Jokic was that it doesn't matter how far your feet get off the ground. What matters is how quickly you can get to the ball. Jokic had one of the lowest vertical jumps ever measured at P3. Elliott spoke of P3's 10.6 drill, which measures how fast an athlete can get their hand to the spot 10.6 feet above the ground. This is about where a basketball would be as it bounces off the rim. The idea is that getting there quickly is more important than how far off the ground you get with your feet. Nikola was in the top 10 of all time. Jokic's smile. Jokic's nonchalance in his movements is mirrored in his facial expressions, which can seem at times goofy, sweet, or strangely detached, a deadpan approaching Buster Keaton's. Clips of him interacting with children suggest he has a knack for making them laugh, play acting, being playful. In one, he insists to a group of kids who want him to dunk that he can't do it. They refuse to believe this. At last he tries and the ball gets wedged between the backboard and the rim. The clip ends there, like a scene from Charlie Chaplin or Keaton, but in color. The viewer cannot help but imagine what comes next. The gentle giant pretends to jump and free the ball, but cannot. This penchant for drollery extends to his post-game media appearances. A clip from early on in his career fascinated me. He's asked about a remarkable pass he made to his teammate at the time, Kenneth Furman. Kenneth jumps really high, Jokic said. All you have to do is throw the ball up high. The desire to minimize, to avoid not only self-aggrandizement, but hyperbole of any kind, doesn't even feel like a wish or a desire with Jokic. It feels like a reflexive act of self-preservation. The interviewer, unsatisfied with this answer, rephrases the question. There must be more to it than that. How did he do it? Just throw the ball up, said Jokic. The interviewer tries again. For a moment, the scene takes on the uncomfortable feeling of a teacher in elementary school trying to nudge their not terribly bright student toward an epiphany. Jokic is like the student who will not be nudged. Throw the ball up, Jokic repeats, in a tone of voice within which one can detect, like the flavor of almond lurking within marzipan, a hint of irony. At some point in his unlikely ascent, photographs began circulating of Jokic as a nearly obese teenager with dark-rimmed eyes. He looked troubled and even sad. Then there was the photograph of an even younger Jokic, looking pudgy in a nice shirt as though dressed for a special occasion. He turns to the camera and offers a sweetly mischievous smile. These images are important parts of the Jokic legend. They lend him an underdog aura, as though all his jersey featured an invisible Chico's Bail Bonds logo on the back. For me, Jokic offers the incredible example of someone who looks intimidated, but is not intimidated. Strong faces was a refrain among Greg Popovich and his coaching staff as the 2020 American Olympic team was on their way to a gold medal. Jokic has the impassive, disinterested expression of a sweetheart who would rather get a pastry than a bucket. And I don't mean this purely as a remark about weight. He has the leisurely, mid-schlag sense of tempo and pleasure I associate with the former countries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On another occasion, when he was crowded by reporters in the locker room after recording his first triple-double, he was asked if it was his coach, Michael Malone, who gave him the game ball. "Yes," said Jokic. Then I hugged him. A benign and placid smile creeps over his face as some of the reporters laugh. "Yeah," he continues, "I was naked and I hugged him." The room erupts in laughter, and he feigns confusion as though naked hugging happens all the time in NBA locker rooms. "It's the truth," he says. Jokic has a broad, bland smile containing within it the hint of some inward-directed joke which reminds me of Stan Laurel. Then there's something my old high school and college classmate, in him of Michael Diamond. Something about Jokic's physical appearance, his at times twitchy mannerisms, his sense of humor, reminds me of Mike D. as a young man. Once you picture Jokic dressed in a leather pork pie hat and sunglasses with a giant car medallion hanging from his neck as a gold chain, a la Mike D. in the Fight for Your Right to Party video, you cannot unsee it. It is a bit overdetermined that Jokic's name is Joker. It is inappropriate precisely because it is too on the nose. He is a basketball player who in every way is confounding and surprising. This is true of his most subtle movements on the court and also of the larger trajectory of what can now be described with a straight face as the Jokic myth. But then Jokic is a master of misdirection. Perhaps it is appropriate that I am talking about all these comedians when he is in fact a magician. His greatest trick has been to turn a fat, ungainly, confused-looking teenager whose nose turns dark red after running up and down the court a few times into one of the greatest basketball players in the world. And I'm now going to skip ahead and read in one section more, which is delayed the publication of this book considerably. So I want to honor that fact by bringing it to Denver. It's called Jokic's Brothers. Jokic has two older brothers, Nemanja and Strahimja. They moved with him to America and live with him and his girlfriend, now wife, functioning as chaperones, personal cooks, cheerleaders, and most of all bodyguards. They are large, tattooed men who seem to have anger issues. They'll try, this is a quote, "They'll try to come out on the court and fight every other game," Jokic's teammate Michael Porter Jr. said in an interview. "They're like mobsters," I said laughing. Then at the end of the Nuggets, I should have written this a little differently. Then at the end of the Nuggets, a recent Nuggets season, Jokic was ejected for a flagrant foul in Game 4 of the Sun series in the 2021 playoffs. Yeah, I know. I was vaguely hoping to get right there. We planned it. and stop a fast break. Not unusual in itself, but the gesture contained the frustration of losing, and pain fell to the ground. Devin Booker charged Jokic. What followed was a highly uncharacteristic confrontation, chest to chest, that pained me. Jokic's face was no longer goofy and amiable, but instead had narrowed to a beaky point of anger as he muttered threats to Devin Booker in a face-to-face confrontation. As disturbing as this was, it was even more disturbing when the camera cut to the two enraged brothers, Nemanja and Strahinja, in the stands, just a few rows off the court, their necks bulging and faces red as they shouted and gesticulated violently, while security guards stood with their hands up, almost beseeching them to calm down. They seemed to be on the verge of charging the court. There was something touching and even cathartic about the brothers' rage on behalf of their kid brother, Nikola, their desire to intervene, but it was also disturbing. It forced me to acknowledge that in my enthusiasm for Jokic, I'd made him into a goofy, benign teddy bear, and the brothers into a kind of id, stored on an external hard drive. But these were his brothers. Their shouting and scene-making was, it turned out, a trait inherited from their father, who behaved in just such a bellicose way when it came to their basketball games in Serbia. A Lee Jenkins Sports Illustrated profile of Jokic in 2007 summons the image of Nikola as a small child being terrorized by his much older brothers, Strahinja in particular, who would toss him, quote, from one bed to another in the family's small apartment, often during heated games on a plastic mini hoop. Jokic then, says, he once held down my arms and threw knives all around my head. Punishment for refusing to climb a tree during a picnic. That was a little scary. In that same article, Jenkins outlines a 2004 tableau in which Nemanja, the middle Jokic, is playing college basketball in Detroit and living at the lakeside mansion of his friend and countryman, Darko Milicic, a brooding figure mostly remembered as the Detroit Pistons' catastrophic second selection after LeBron in a draft that also featured Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade. The atmosphere at the Darko mansion was one of decadence and opportunity squandered. Nemanja is quoted as saying, he is adamant that Nikola should not make the same mistakes. But the juxtaposition between Jokic, the superstar, and his brothers who played ball but never at a high level, is not one of partying versus diligence and hard work. The Jokic brothers are poster boys for a kind of masculinity that some people might describe as toxic. Most sports fans are not only familiar with this outward-facing toughness, they enjoy it. A similar sensibility celebrates mobsters. The brothers are, in their attitudes and presentation, the antithesis of soft, softness being the most contemptuous of insults to give a basketball player. Jokic, Nikola Jokic, exists entirely outside this paradigm. It's not just that his body is or seems soft. It's his attitude, his vibe, his willingness to joke around and show joy, his enjoyment of nature, his obsession with horses, his comfort with his own cuddly eccentricity. He is the Superman of soft. Although Jokic is often compared to Larry Bird, in this sense, he shares more with Magic Johnson. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. And now, Mike,
Yeah.
you and I are going to just pretend we're on the phone.
Okay.
So you start. What do you want to talk about with all this that's going on?
Well, I mean, as that last section you just talked about his brothers, we were just in Philadelphia. I was just in Philadelphia with the team, and somehow his brothers came up again. And he said something to the effect of, yeah, they're pretty much like all brothers. And then when I hear the story of him throwing knives around Joker's head, I'm like, there's nothing normal about the Joker brothers. So I just love, and I had just read your book, so I have that in the back of my mind and contrasting it. As I'm kind of talking to Joker throughout the season, it's kind of hard to figure out new angles and new things to talk to him about, but my ears always perk up when the brothers come up, because it's rare that he will divulge certain details about his brother. But all right, anything you want to say about your brothers, I'm good.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to dilate a little more on the Sports Illustrated article I alluded to, because, it was someone else's article from a long time ago about people who are not my subject. but the idea that there was this 19-year-old brooding Slavic Gatsby in Lake Michigan with this huge mansion filled with his Serbian compatriots and other people going to the Detroit College, and young college students who are athletes, populating a big mansion, drinking, partying, while Darko Milicic's professional career goes violently into the tank. The tank is too pleasant a word for what it went into. Just in every way, the people drafted after him it was terrible, and then he just became a paradigm of frustration, and it's almost like a shorthand for an error on the part of judgment and discerning talent being such an obsessively just big part of NBA, professional sports. Someone made the biggest mistake ever. Conversely, and so Nikola is supposed to be the complete opposite, and he is, because he's the other end of the extreme, one of the greatest second-round draft pick of all time. No one has achieved this level of success having been drafted at number 45. But I loved the brothers. It's almost like they were scared straight, because I think on some level they would be maybe a little less in control, but they've seen out of control. They've seen undisciplined behavior, and it went really wrong. And then now they've got this goose with this golden egg, and they're protecting it. But I struggle with that passage because, when I start off talking about him being like a kid who'd been punched in the nose, that's one of the things about him I just think is so remarkable. It's not just that he has talent to be able to move a ball over from here to there. Like one of the unread chapters is called Jokic's bunnies, because a bunny is like when you're just 2 feet away. And speaking as a very low level but relatively tall person, they're the worst shot you can take. It's a nightmare. Bunnies are nightmares. They're all downside. No one gets credit for hitting a bunny. You're just like, oh my God. It's like being on the high dive board when you're a kid. You just don't want to jump if there's a line. It's just a nightmare. And Jokic hits all his bunnies. He's so talented. But he's also functioning completely outside the brothers' paradigm. And that's normal sports world, and he's somewhere else.
You think that, but they are very, very close to Nikola. Strahinja and Nemanja, they come to every single game. If you're at the games, you can't miss them. They walk in right as the buzzer is starting, right at tip-off, and you just see the brothers just like kind of saunter through, get to their seats. They sit in mid-court all the time. And so you made the point, to what degree are they still involved, and to what degree were they protective of Nikola? So this past summer, he signed the biggest contract extension in NBA history. The first step to that, so the order of operations was Tim Connolly, the former Nuggets president, he leaves. He goes to Minnesota. There's this question, is Joker content? Is he going to be happy? Does he want to sign this deal in Denver? And the first layer was getting to the brothers. The first layer was management going to the brothers and say, hey, we have a plan here. This is what the future looks like. You should be okay, with your prime in Denver. And there's, literal bodyguards. They are kind of the first line of defense for Joker. And the other thing that is somewhat reported, but a little bit underreported, is how instrumental Strahinja, the bigger one, was in Nikola's development. He kind of put his personal interests aside, and he moved to Belgrade with Nikola when he was kind of developing as a young player, and said, I'm going to monitor you, I'm going to train you hard, I'm going to be, the quote-unquote babysitter who's kind of overseeing you. So when you talk about the Darko comparison, they are essentially, making it so that he cannot fail. They are creating a safety net for him, and they're saying, if you're going to fail, we're going to be part of that as well. You are not going to be isolated. So I don't know to what degree people think that they are or not involved, but this family is close. And the brothers, they're the gatekeepers to Joker.
But there's more going on there. Will you share the red sports car anecdote?
So I did one of his MVP stories. I was telling Tom yesterday, I always try to do something significant, obviously, when he wins the MVP.
He's talking about this as though, like, in the fall, the leaves turn.
Right, as sure as the sun will rise, Joker will win the MVP. But, so it was funny, I didn't tell you this part, I didn't tell you how I stumbled upon this, but basically, I'm driving up Spear one day, and I get there about 4:45 for a 7 o'clock game, and I'm following this red I don't know that it might have been a red Porsche, like a red Porsche SUV, and it says Joker on the license plate. I'm like, okay, well, guess this is Joker's car. And I'm following him into the parking lot. I'm going to park, he goes into the parking lot or whatever, and that ends up being like one of my lead anecdotes for this MVP story. And I later get to talk to Strahenia about that car, and he goes, yeah, that's my car. Nikola does not drive a red SUV Porsche, but it just says, I guess everyone goes by Joker in that family.
Right, isn't that interesting? Like,
yeah. That's not, I don't know what his, maybe like a Honda Civic or something. I don't know what his preferred car, I don't know what he would drive if, he'd probably drive a horse chariot to the game if it was up to him, but that part was really interesting, and just kind of pulling the curtain back on the Jokic family, and how, and I see his wife all the time. She's unbelievably sweet, says hello to me all the time. This is the essence of Joker. Does not care. Once the game is over, he wants to get back to his family. He hates going on the road because he says, I see my daughter, and then I go on a road trip, and I get back, and she's a different person. Like, this is his priority, is his family. And maybe that makes him an atypical superstar in and of itself, but that's his priority. He's like, all that matters to me is my family. If you were to ask him, it's family first, his daughter is immediate family, and then basketball. And I don't know how you can fault him for that.
yeah, no faulting. Well, I mentioned my interest in him again a few years ago, and there's been changes since then. Physical changes that are really conspicuous. He still looks like a preposterous figure to suggest. If someone didn't know too much about basketball, went to a game and just walked onto the floor when the players were warming up and said, look at all the players taking shots, tell me who the superstar player is. It just seems so unlikely that even within the first 10 people, it could be 11, I don't know. Maybe they'd say Jose Alvarez would be like 12, but he now looks like a plausible NBA player. He's pretty lean. And it was only a couple of years ago that he looked like somebody who was eating like chocolate milk powder out of the can with the spoon. And in fact, one of my little sub-chapters was to get on the phone with a scholar of Serbian history and break down this one particular form of Serbian street food, like the Serbian hot dog, or the sort of a meat and cheese thing. And actually, I want to address this to you though for a second, because you brought up Serbia. We're living in a very curious time in the former Yugoslavia has enormous sway in the fortunes of the NBA, and when the NBA, which is this very American sport, obviously has gone global to a degree that our other big sports haven't, and now the fruits of that are that we have non-American NBA superstars. What do you feel his Serbianness, what's going on with Nikola and Serbia, and how does that fit into his identity?
When you kind of look at who Joker is, he hates, obviously you guys all know this, he hates talking about himself. It is the antithesis of who he is. So when he keeps winning these MVPs, he can't stand it, because, and I know that sounds ridiculous, because it like eats at who he is, because he feels that an MVP indicates that you have played selfishly. By attaining all these stats and scoring all these points, he's like, you can't win an MVP. He's told his trainer this, Felipe Eichenberg. He's told him, you can't win unless you're getting 25 plus points a game, and he hates that. He doesn't like celebrating himself. He doesn't like when he is compelled and forced to score, when the offense needs him to do that. So you ask, how does that influence his makeup? That is who he is. He hates. That's part of the reason I don't think he wants to win another MVP. He doesn't like the questions. And as absurd as that is, he wants to shed light on the team. And this is, I've heard Michael Malone talk about this, and I've heard Jamal Murray talk about this. That attitude has trickled down to the rest of the team. Why have they led the NBA in assists, or been in the top 3 in assists for the past 4 or 5 years? Yes, it has a lot to do with Jokic, but a lot of them have bought into this ethos of it is more fun, more engaging, and oh, by the way, we're pretty damn good when we pass the ball and share the ball. That is, I mean, you asked what Jokic's legacy is, that's it. If he can convince an entire franchise of ostensibly individual players who care about individual stats and achieving accolades and all-stars and what that, you can convince an entire franchise to buy into that. You're so good that you can convince them, that's his legacy. And I think a week or two ago, he passed Alex English for the most assists in Nuggets franchise history. That was the first time I've ever heard him say, I'm actually proud of this one. Like, of all the things that he's checked off, that's the one that resonated because it indicates that I'm not a selfish player. And I think he's almost scared to be painted in that light because of his individual success and because of the MVPs.
Like, I feel if you had gone to some of the great silent movie stars like Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and explained to them that we were going to play like a game, like an acting game, and we're going to give you a ball or a potato or some object, a hat, that your role is to, you'd rather not have this thing. You're actually quite embarrassed to have this thing, and we're just going to hand it to you, and you're going to hand it to somebody else, and then you're going to get handed it back. I feel like it would look a little bit like Nikola Jokic playing NBA basketball. He gets the ball, and there's a immediate sense of, I really would rather not have this. How can I make this go away? You know?
So what's funny about that, your theory, and I don't know how much that's grounded in, how much you know, but there are statistics that track time of possession. And so Nikola will have, let's say 1 to 2 seconds time of possession every time he touches the ball. Whereas the other best players in the league, Luka Doncic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, they're holding on to the ball for 4, 5, 6 seconds. So you are absolutely correct that it is get off the ball. Like process and kick and decipher a defense as fast as you can. And so there's no way to measure this, but I think I texted you today, it's his processing speed that is unbelievable. If you watched the game last night, he and Jamal Murray operated his pick and roll. As soon as Jokic got it, he passed it to Aaron Gordon. I think before Aaron Gordon was ready to receive the pass. And that is his processing and knowing how the defense is going to react. And his skill set is in his brain power. That it is just able to pick defenses apart. That's I think what his gift is. And the only other thing I wanted to add about, we talked about, is he an athlete and what is his physique now? Talking to some of the Nuggets assistant coaches, they will actively have you question how you define an athlete. Because this is a 7-footer who has unbelievable coordination. And they're like, who can move, who can take the ball full court. Maybe he can't dunk in the dunk contest, but he's still taking the ball full court. He's making the opponents operate at his speed. And that is a level of athleticism. Maybe it's not, what we come to know as athleticism, but the way that he contorts his body, slows down, and makes people operate at his pace is a level of control that, dominates the NBA, whether it's, typical athleticism or not.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'd like to open this up for questions from you guys. I want to just add one thing on that note, which is I think you're absolutely correct about his capacity, his processing speed. But I also want to just go back to my very fanciful notion that, because when you say he's an amazing athlete, he's incredibly coordinated, he processes things, it's all in a positive sports spirit. Like, I'm going to do this because I want to win, because I want to achieve, I want to score the bucket. And I just can't help, this is about me, not him, I'm just projecting, but I just can't help but see this other thing happening too, which is the more neurotic version of that, which is the Chaplin game, or the acting game, where you're like, I give this to you, I'm giving it right back. You just, there's a very interesting unity of the yin-yang of like what he's talented in, and then what he needs, just like the aversion to hyperbole. That's why I got so amused by that very innocuous TV interview. Hey, athletes get asked this all the time, and they're always giving these boring questions because there's no answer. Like, so-and-so, how did you do that thing with the ball? Like, what do you, I jumped, and then I moved my arm back. Like, it doesn't work that way. But that's why when he was like, well, Kenneth can jump really high, so you just throw the ball out. And he's like, yeah, but how did it? He's like, no, you just throw the ball out. Like, that insistence It's part of a very curious ecosystem, and then I think we should let, if you have questions, I do want to just share that the Brothers chapter, it was the last thing I wrote in the piece, and it was so important for me because I realized that part of what makes him so interesting, besides all the basketball curiosity, the physical, the choreographical curiosity, the interpersonal drollery, which I go on and put much great length in another portion of this, where I start getting into Bill Murray comparisons, but there's, most big-time athletes are very macho and very alpha, like Michael Jordan, John Morant was like there's some clip of him joking around in like a coffee shop, a waitress is like, wait, who are you? And one of his entourage, or he even himself said something like Black Jesus. And I mean, he's great, I'm all for him, but like, it's just comical to think about that level of grandiosity in comparison to Nikola Jokic. He's such an outlier in that regard. And somehow I thought the brothers were an important part of that story. The violence, the bellicosity, the essentially tough guy stuff. He's got them handling that. I mean, they're there, after all. They're in the building. But he then can be left to doing his own curious thing.
Although he does have temper. We all know.
Well, that's what was
he has
so
a temper.
upsetting about the camera. We have a question.
Yeah, but I was going to say, I think part of this, he's working on his law of karma. He has figured out dealing with his temper and all that that's come back. And as an athlete, all this is paying off because he doesn't want to take credit. And by sharing and being cooperative is so much better. It's a great story. I never knew all this backstory. So thank you. Oh,
Thank you for coming to the Institute for Jokic Studies. I'll go to the gentleman in the back with the glasses. Right? Yeah, that was you. The other guy in the jacket.
Can you give us a sense of how much time were you able to spend with him directly, as opposed to what you read and heard about? Given his shyness.
Yeah. So I did not do normal journalistic profile practice, which Mike does, and like I mentioned, Lee Jenkins was a famous, in which you are granted a period of time with your subject. It could be an athlete or a movie star or whoever, and you have an hour or two, or maybe you're granted an afternoon, or you're allowed to trail around on the movie set, or you're allowed to trail around, and conduct an interview. I didn't attempt that with him, but neither did I just do this watching TV. I put myself in his physical proximity as much as I could, and what that meant was, for most of the time I was writing this piece, I was living in New Orleans, and when the Nuggets came, I would stake out the baseline where the journalists are allowed to hang out when they're just doing pre-games, and just stare at him and usually videotape it, and just watch his movements and his interactions, and they know what's going on. They're used to this. It's a little weird. It's at the very least someone's looking at me like, what the hell? This is a little too obsessive. So I didn't spend time with him one-on-one and ask him questions, but neither was I just looking at a screen. I was close to him, and I really scrutinized his body, his body language, both the movements as he practiced basketball, but just talking to his colleagues, if you will. And then there was some time in the locker room and his interactions, and then the piece ends with a description of him on a Zoom call, because there's a period of time during the Zoom era of sports writing and I saw this poor Mike Singer here. It'd be like Mike Singer on Zoom with like some guy from, and I say this with no disrespect, random news outlets, in fact foreign countries, and he had to do really all the heavy lifting and all the work. I'm digressing into this, but suffice it to say, I could see him on the Zoom. You have a very, that's the one thing you get a close-up. He's much closer to someone's face than you do in person. The piece ends with describing what he's doing with his lips while, he's just filled with these like curious movements and tics. So it was both. I did spend time with him, but not in the normal journalistic way. Why don't you call the next person?
Okay, we're going to go to the back again.
Sorry, did you get a sense of it?
Well, there's another back even behind you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
We go even further back than you.
So, it seems like Jokic is kind of like an American culture shock. Like, obviously, we're all talking about like how he reveres his family and is so different from like typical superstars in sports. And I was just wondering if you think that you would be able to attribute that to like the Serbian culture or the way that basketball is taught overseas, where it's not as like isolation ball or different areas.
I definitely think that that's how basketball is played, specifically in Europe. I mean, you talk to some of the European guys on the Nuggets, and they're like, Eurobasket is completely different. Like, there is smarter basketball being played in European basketball than in the NBA, which is interesting in and of itself. But I definitely think that he will say often that the only thing that his goal coming to the NBA was to stay as long as possible. He said this 3 days ago in Philadelphia. My goal when I came here was just to be in the NBA as long as possible. He never had designs on being the first, second round pick to win an MVP, or doing it a second time, or making the All-Star game 5 times. He was just happy to be here. So when you talk about his priorities, I think he recognizes his family boosted him up. He recognizes all his brothers did, and he knows that he wouldn't be there without them. So yes, that has to do with the family and his background, but he also he arrived at superstardom in a completely different way than any other superstar that we're accustomed to in the NBA. Even Giannis was the 15th pick overall. But prior to Joker, Giannis and Steph Curry were the lowest draft picks to ever win MVP at 15, and Joker was 41. That's how, astounding this dude is, and how rare it is.
Yeah. I'm going to just briefly answer your question for myself and say, I don't think the shock has really taken place, because I think the American culture has been unable to assimilate. I think it's been very difficult for American culture to figure out a way to talk about this guy. He's won the MVP twice. That's a very high-profile thing. If you could do a sports metric, some kind of statistic for least famous person, or least recognized person who's had that level of accomplishment, I think the culture, sports culture, American culture, is starting to find a language to celebrate what he does. But as recently as last year, there was this, I was about to say forgive me for going into this, but if I can't talk about it with you guys at the Institute for Jokic Studies, there was a moment around this time in the season, actually, last year, where there's a TV set up. You had Zach Lowe, Richard Jefferson, Kendrick Perkins, and they were going to have one of their little, shooting the shit about the state of the sports world. And Zach Lowe started making noises about Jokic as a potential repeat MVP winner. And Perkins and Jefferson just exploded in derision and exasperation. Give me Richard Jefferson buried his face in his hands, and I think there was a lot going on there. Some of it was those two guys are players. I think the thing that, for the record, the thing that was least going on there involved race, actually. I don't actually think it was a racial thing, but it was two players versus a nerdy journalist, sports numbers cruncher guy. But then there was also something else, like they just grit their teeth and tolerated the first MVP, but like, don't make us go through that shit again. This guy, are you kidding me? And I actually, it's in this piece, I spent some time just on a Zoom interview with Perkins again and Jalen Rose, and they were doing a pre-playoff thing, and they made ESPN had made them available to some journalists. So they were covering all the bases, and they were excited, they had an audience, and they were talking on this kind of private Zoom, if you will, or something, and I said, raised my hand, I was like, it's Tom Ballard from the New Yorker, I'd like to bring up the subject of Nikola Jokic. And the pleasure metric just like plummeted. They just like looked ashen and unhappy. And they only perked up, they talked in a game, but ultimately they ended up making fat jokes. Perkins was like, I had the same problem, like you could never get a 6-pack, it was always a 4-pack and a little pudge.
Whack bodies.
Whack body, yeah, you must have, how did you know that?
I just heard him say it.
He said it multiple times. He said it like 2 weeks ago. He calls him whack body Jokic.
I don't know if I was there for the dawn of the whack body era, but it just, so the question about how it's this culture shock, it's not that shocked because there's a lot of non-assimilating, like resistance.
And real quick, if I could just add, one of my favorite things that happens around the All-Star game is that the players vote. They account for 25% of the vote. And so the NBA PR, after it's announced that Joker will be an All-Star starter again, they send out a PDF of all the players who garnered all-star starter votes from the fellow players.
Versus fans,
Versus fans versus media, but they rank the players in terms of how many votes they got from the respective and fellow players. Nikola Jokic tied Giannis Antetokounmpo for most votes accrued across the entire NBA for guys who deserve to be a starter. That took
The players.
the players, and you know, with all due respect to Perk and Jalen Rose, who really gives a damn what they say when the players recognize how special he is? If they are deeming you the most worthy starter in the NBA, along with Giannis, who is, we all know who Giannis is, we all know what Giannis looks like, what are we even talking about here? And maybe those talk shows don't want to know about that because that undermines all their fat jokes.
Yeah.
Sam, I'm going to hold out on you. I'm not going to make you wait. He's an inside guy here from the Denver Post. We can't be seen to be giving him special preference. How about this gentleman right here?
Two things. Richard Jefferson and Perkins have come full circle, and now they think he should win the third MVP in a row. So Jokic has won them over. They will no longer be depressed when you bring him up with that. But
For the record, I've seen this, and I feel this is penance on some level.
And then the other question is it just totally coincidence that the best tennis player in the world is from Serbia, the best basketball player in the world is from Serbia? And or is there something magical about this country? Like, what would you say?
You want to hear it?
I have my version.
Okay, my version is, from what I know about Serbians, and I've made some inroads in Serbia, they are extremely competitive, extremely prideful people. And, like, you know, I know what Nikola says on the outside. I understand that he's extremely humble. I just talked to former Nuggets president Tim Connolly 2 weeks ago. He told me that he is the most competitive person that he's ever come across. When they were in the bubble, they were playing a game called Blockus. I'm not even sure what Blockus is, but they were playing Blockus in the bubble, and Joker wanted to win that very badly. When they were playing Keep Away in the pool, he wanted to win that very badly. So I think that it's something about wanting to represent, there's this whole debate when he plays for the national team, will he play for the national team? And he takes a ton of pride in it, but it's also overexertion, you know, after what he's done throughout the whole season. So he takes immense pride in representing his country. And I think that is something about the people, that they want to portray themselves, you know, as elite competitors on a global scale.
My answer to that is twofold. One is I just wanted to report or share with you that when I would be typing on my phone, making notes, the autocorrect would jump in when I wrote Jokic and turn it to Jokic at all times. And then finally, at a certain point, it started to change it to Djokovic. And it was almost like the AI had sort of come to some understanding.
The other thing I want to say is, weirdly enough, at one point in an attempt to sort of get some insight into all this, I started reading this fascinating but 1,000-page book called Black Lamb, Gray Falcon, which is a book this English journalist, Rebecca West. It was a road trip she took in the run-up to World War II, and she did like a sort of report from the Balkans. And it's 1,000 pages, and it's actually kind of funny at times, very detailed. But the sense I got from reading that book was a great emphasis on like folk customs and local customs and sort of handmade things and making things, doing them well with your crafts, if you will. And I wonder if that sense of meticulous care about this is how it should be done, it finds some manifestation in sports. So we go over here and then over there.
This isn't so much a question as it is an observation, maybe in painful lighting. Well, the last night of the coverage for the game, the TNT announcers, one of them said, I think Joker did sort of this crossover move to the basket, and he literally said basketball poetry, and it stood out, and I really love that I'm here now in this moment after equating that to him in his movements. But what I started thinking about that, because I agree with you, the sort of fascinating thing about it to me is more about what I would sort of say is more the awkwardness, right? And so poetry is not necessarily what we would always use to describe that, but there is a true beauty, I think, in the things that he does. And as an artist, like I really love looking for the beauty in those spaces, right? Like where the non-traditional areas, right? Like the awkwardness and what we typically would maybe normally call ugly or unattractive. So there's something about all these things coming together for me that I find really interesting. I think I haven't read the book yet, and I will. I'm glad I have my copy. Thank you. I think your description with the nose and all the arm scratches and all the things that I've been really fascinated in are what make him super unique. And it is an awkwardness, I think, of sorts. And then maybe that's part of like, we want our superstars and athletes to be cool and masculine and sort of unaffected, and he doesn't seem to be any of that.
If I may just jump in and connect it to the Serbian question. There's this moment in the playoffs, I guess last year, with Luka Doncic, who's a sort of curious, like cousin alter ego and it's very memorable to me, and I think a lot of people closely watching the league, in which the Dallas Mavericks have lost to Game 5 to the Phoenix Suns, and their star has made some, snarky added jokes of some kind, Devin Booker. And Luka Doncic comes off and he goes, "Everybody talk tough when they're up." And he makes this gesture. Everybody talks tough when they're up. And it was like he could have been in like a Run DMC video or something. Like complete, speaking the language of like international guy, tough athlete, and then he proceeded to just destroy the Phoenix Suns. I mean, it was an amazing, but Nikola exists outside of that economy. I just want to, and that is interesting. This gentleman in the red.
Yeah, a couple things. So, there's this picture of Nikola when he's like 8, he's wearing a Nuggets shirt. I just found that like a bizarre coincidence. Any insight into that? How many other NBA team shirts did he wear? Or
No, that picture's unbelievable. I was actually texting Mishko, who was his European agent.
Yeah.
He discovered that shirt, that picture, which came from Joker's family. They were like, it was like a family friend or something. It was like sifting through old photos and came across him wearing a Nuggets jersey or like shirt, sweatshirt. I asked him about it a week ago. He had no idea. He's like, man, how could you ever know? Like, I just wore what I wore. Like, nobody, who knows? But it would be a really interesting question. Did you have any other NBA paraphernalia? I didn't.
Is that the picture? So I went to the game with a press credential last night and went to the locker room and was just sort of, taking it in, as you might imagine. And Jokic's locker had a couple of very curious things on it. One was a ribbon for a horse race. He won a race. This one red ribbon. We'll get to that later, possibly. But there was also a photograph. And I didn't want to go be too intrusive, so I didn't stick my face into the photograph. But
I don't think so.
It's not that.
I don't think so. That is like.
He looked more like a teenager in that.
That is honestly like part of his kind of myth and part of his story is like all these things that we find fascinating, he like shrugs off. He's like, don't bother me with that. Like, it happened. It's part of my history. There's nothing there. And which is frustrating, but also a funny challenge for me when I'm trying to like tug on yarn and see if there's anything there. He just will swat you down at every opportunity. He's like, there's nothing here. Like, it was a random occurrence that I happen to have this shirt. Don't make it, I mean, maybe someone would have dug up an old picture of him in a Bulls jersey had he gotten drafted there. But it's definitely, I think they actually discovered that photo when the whole team went there for the MVP ceremony, or when they surprised him in Sambor.
Yeah.
That was when it like came to fruition. They were like, oh my God. And then we need to save this for a perfect time. And then they ended up, Mishko ended up sharing it when Joker was signing the biggest deal in NBA history. That was it. This is the coronation.
And then so still curious the Cameron Payne played. Do you think he whacked his nose? Did he touch his nose? I thought Cameron Payne got the ball and the family jewels, and that's why he dropped it. After 3 minutes, Jokic gets thrown out.
Well, I think Jokic got ejected that game because of the cockback. I think it was such a vicious cockback that it was like at this point there's damage can be done. Yeah. Whether damage was inflicted, who knows? But at this point, something scary is about to happen, and you see it in the photo. So I don't know if he actually touched him, but I remember I asked Malone after the game, and he's just like dumbfounded. Again, their season has just ended. He's dumbfounded. Our guy just got ejected off that, the NBA MVP, and just behind the scenes of how the
Why is he dumbfounded?
Because he did not think that warranted an ejection. It warranted a technical foul, a flagrant 1, but not a flagrant 2. And the way that the NBA works is they assign a pool reporter for every single game in the event that something crazy happens. So the season has just ended, and it's about to end. Joker gets ejected. I'm the pool reporter, which means I need to go ask the NBA, I need to send it through the proper channels that I'm going to ask the official what happened after the game. And mind you, my hair is on fire. And I'm trying to like coordinate all these emails and do all these things and ask questions in the post-game on Zoom while trying to do this interview with the official who gives not a good explanation. And that was how that whole thing unraveled, but they were just at their wits' end. That he got ejected because of that. But I think it was this. This was pretty scary.
I have a question.
Sure, and then after you, we'll go to Sam Tabacci.
So,
Inside man.
it's interesting just learning about how his culture and being from Serbia has really influenced the person he is and the player he is. But I want to know what the Nuggets culture and Denver culture has sort of done to shape him and bring him to greatness. Like, could any other team or city have facilitated that kind of rise for him?
Well, it's interesting because he recently said, having been to every city, on the NBA circuit, having gotten to know every NBA city, if he could choose, he would choose Denver. Now, maybe he was just satiating a lot of people, but I think that, it really suits him. He does not like being in the spotlight. He prefers the anonymity. He doesn't like being on, he's not on TV, that's a different story. But he does not like being spotlighted. It's interesting because sometimes he'll go out, or sometimes they'll order food or whatever. He has his brothers pick up as if they're anonymous guys. He'll have his brothers pick up the food because he doesn't want to be asked for autographs or questions or pictures or whatever. How have the Nuggets shaped him? What's really interesting is, like I was kind of explaining about the unselfishness, they have all adopted his philosophy. When I always say this, when your best player is as unselfish and as humble and works as hard as he does, nobody else has an excuse not to fall in line. And everybody has bought into it. So if they win or if they don't, if they win a championship or if they don't, they will do it following his example and his blueprint. And I think everyone has sort of adopted that mindset because of how special he is. And everyone's like, how are we this lucky to have drafted this guy? One of the favorite quotes I've ever gotten from a player was, I think about 2018 or 2019, I asked Will Barton about Jokic and how much he enjoyed watching Jokic dominate more physically lean, more seemingly athletic players. And he goes, man, watching the life fall out of their eyes when this fat, unathletic, MFer is dominating you, it brought me so much joy. And I've never heard another player say that. Will Barton says a lot of things, but that was a beautiful thing that Will told me. And I just said 230 votes is what he garnered. He's got respect. There's no way you're at this level and you don't have your colleagues' respect.
I have a question that I would like to ask before Sam.
Okay. Anything to keep kicking Sam down the line?
No, because mine is a little bit of a soccer question. And I'm wondering, I think, we've always loved Jokic as, a fun, and we probably over-index on, his goofiness just because he's, creative and alternative and has a certain way of playing. But he did seem to be just, a little bit more of a lighter player and having more fun. And I'm wondering, do you feel like Jokic is sad this year? And is it just because he has a kid and he's really busy and he's just trying to get off the court? Or is he getting a little bit more serious and a little bit more down?
I don't know if it's sad, but I do think that his patience, this part's interesting. I really do think his patience is waning. He's like, I have given, especially the last 2 years when everyone's been hurt, I have poured everything I possibly can into my workouts, into my post-game workouts, into setting an example. I've done all these things to drag this team to the playoffs, on consecutive seasons without a lot of help, that it's like, all right, I have help now. Nobody else has a reason to not approach this seriously. So when you brought up the TNT interview, and I'm sure you guys have all seen it, where he's talking about wearing suits, I'm taking a professional approach to the game. That's why I'm dressing like I am. Like, there's just no more joking around. The expectations are higher. The money is, you can't disassociate. He just signed a $250 million contract. He always calls it a job. He always calls it like it's a work, it's an obligation, it's a professional job. And he definitely enjoys it, but there are aspects that he doesn't enjoy. He talks, he doesn't talk all the time, but I've heard it enough where it pains him to go on the road. He doesn't like being away. He said it's monotonous. We do the same thing over. We go out as a team. We go shoot around. We get in the game. I lift. I do ice bath. We fly to the next city. Land at 4 a.m. That becomes taxing on a person. And especially when so much has been put on his shoulders as the face of the franchise. I think that there's some aspect of him that's tired. I think there's some aspect of him that's impatient. It's like, it's go time now. I don't think he's sad. I think he has people, but he recognizes this is work. This is not, I think he's beyond the point of, I'm just happy to be here. If that makes any sense. Are we to Sam?
I think we're ready. I think we're all ready for the question.
It's an amazing question. I'm always curious when players say like who they looked up to or watched as a kid, and Jason Tatum. There's a whole generation that grew up on Kobe. It was Kobe this. Everyone wanted to be Kobe, like ISO mid range, and before that it was Jordan, who was Kobe before Kobe, right? Where it's just this is the way, this is the guy. So I'm wondering who Jokic looked up to or who he idolized, when he was growing up.
Well, I don't think, he always says this, he didn't watch a lot of NBA growing up. He didn't have access to it. I think he did watch once YouTube became a thing, I think that he did watch some highlights. But the guy who he paints himself as is Tim Duncan. And maybe that's a lofty comparison. Maybe, and it's funny because maybe it's the media who is projecting those questions and will say, do you see yourself as the Tim Duncan? And maybe he answers in the affirmative. But I don't think he's bringing up the Tim Duncan comparison, but it's definitely how Duncan carried himself, understated, humble, a part of a team, aspect with the San Antonio Spurs, and he's just like, the last thing I need to do is win championships. So if there was a comparison, it's definitely Duncan. That's the guy.
I was gonna say, because Duncan, famously hated media. He would show up in jeans. He just wanted to get it over with. But he was also the #1 pick and the most highly touted, prospect in a while, right? When he came to the league.
But Nikola 5,000% enjoys trolling me. At the end of every press conference, he's like, "Thank you guys, my pleasure like always." And then he will smack the table and he leaves. He gets up and leaves, and that's it. And then those are the 7 minutes we get to examine him and look at his quirks and figure out is he trying to say something else. And the other thing that he definitely does not get enough credit for is he's speaking in a different language. So his sarcasm, his humor is on point. There is precise as his passes. And to do that in a different language, it's interesting because early in his career he got into trouble when he tried to make a joke. I'm not going to say it, but he made a gay slur that he didn't know he had picked up from the locker room, and he ended up getting fined for it. He felt so badly about that fine and what happened and the perception about him that the fine happens in the afternoon. We're in Memphis. I think it was 2018, 2019. He was so averse and not wanting to talk to the media that he didn't take a shot until the very last shot of the game in hopes that he wouldn't have to talk to the media about what happened. I swear to God, he game planned that. He ended up missing the shot, and we ended up not talking to him that night. It was fine, but he felt he was ashamed, and he made a mistake, and he didn't know. And it's weighed on him for a while.
I want to just add, since we're getting, I think, a fairly good 360 psychological profile of our subject here. Maybe not enough has been said in this conversation. It's in the piece a little bit about his relationship to horses, which is very intense, And one thing I couldn't quite get into the piece, but I want to share with you guys because it really made an impression, was I dug up an interview he did in 2014 with a guy named Jonathan Givoni, who's fairly interested in like emerging talent, and is like, you know, draft stock type of guy. So he's often interviewing, bubbling up, you know, emerging young people. And he gets to Nikola Jokic. I think it's his very first American media Q&A in this context. And he's been poked in the eye, so one of his eyes is incredibly red. And so the effect of him, like if someone beat him up, you know, this poor guy, what's he been through, that already was there. And Givoni asked him some stout questions. His English isn't very good. He stumbles through, but at some point he said, well, what do you think of America? And he said something like, I think this was in Portland, he said, oh, it's very nice, there's a lot of nature, and he said, it was like such a Ferdinand the Bull answer. He talked about nature, he maybe even referenced horses, and the notion of like, those are his people, that's his happy place. And then he has to spend this period of time in this like concrete dungeon with us, basically. So that's an important part of his outlook.
I mean, speaking about his affinity to nature, in the off season, I don't know a ton about this, but I know that there is a bunker or like a camp that he has built in like a remote part of Sombor, where he just hangs out with his brothers and his godfather and his people, and they just hang out at the Danube River, they fish, they play, it's in your book, foot volley, which is basically, there's like a little net, and they, like, again, speaks to his coordination, just like there's
tennis with your foot.
Tennis with your feet, just like dribbling a ball over this net, and he's addicted to it. That's his favorite thing at home. And they just like fish, they cook, and it's like a remote bunker where he can get away from everybody. And that's his happy place, when he is with those people, the people who are closest to him. I will get there one day.
No, it's just hilarious that a person with that natural proclivity has chosen as a profession where you run around in front of 20,000 people every night in your like underwear.
I want to go a little deeper on exactly that, because this is awesome. Thank you. And we talked about Jokic, right, and Darko, and then Nemanja and Strahinja, and then his father, who's Bellicos, his godfather, his male agent, male coach. Like, and I'm familiar with all that, but still fascinated by it. And I'm realizing in the moment that I don't think I know a thing about his mom. Like, not one thing. And only a little about his wife, that she's sweet. So I'm just curious, for those of you who might have had a chance, like, is she a figure? And this Serbian thing, which we call so macho, and it is, to my understanding, limited. But what's that side of it like?
So it was at the All-Star game last year in Cleveland, and it was like during the day where they practiced, and Joker's goofing around and doing whatever, and I see his brothers, and I know his brothers a little bit, said hello to them. Sitting next to his brothers are the parents. And I go to say hello, and Strahinja's like, no English. Like, no, you cannot, there will be no interaction. So I think I like shook their hands or like nodded to them or whatever I did. So I have these, relatively comfortable conversations with the brothers, fine. Can't talk to the parents, but I go around the corner and it's Natalia, his wife, with their brand new baby. And that's the first time that I've really gotten to engage with his wife and talk to her. And I had this story coming out the following day about Nikola and his relationship with the assistant coach, Ogi Stojakovic, who is the Nuggets assistant coach, is from Belgrade, and they've been together for forever. Ogi and Natalia are close too. They have a lot of family dinners together. So I go to Natalia and I have something to talk about. The story's coming out with, about Ogi and Nikola's relationship, and she just could not be sweeter. Just like, she's like, yeah, Ogi is amazing, his wife is amazing, their daughters, we hang out all the time. Like, they've definitely created like an Eastern European circle in Denver. From like the front office people to Vlatko, Slovenian. The story with his wife is that she came over, I think, to play college volleyball in Texas. That was kind of her background, and I think Nikola was, one of the reasons that they convinced him to come over was because he missed her so much, and it helped. So that's another part of the myth, that Natalia was a part of getting him over here. because there were questions. Nikola had offers and a lot of interest from some club teams in Europe prior to the Nuggets drafting him. So how did he get here? And how much did she weigh on him? But she could not be sweeter. One thing about their kid, they named her Ogniena, which is, she told me this, is a very rare name for a Serbian girl. And for a male, that's normal. But for a Serbian girl, that is a very unique name. And obviously Joker wanted to do something different, which is not surprising.
We'll take maybe one more, I think.
So, what's his ceiling?
What was that question?
What's his ceiling?
For what?
For basketball.
Basketball.
For basketball, yeah.
No, after basketball, we're never going to see him. He's going to be in that bunker. We'll never hear from him again. But in basketball, what's his ceiling?
He has. I'll take it then. I want to hear your answer. Is this the first year? I think this is the first year, or maybe he has one more year on his prior deal, and then he has 5 more years left. I'm not convinced that he's going to play after that. I don't know. He has never really talked about it. He said publicly, I want to play for one franchise. I want to play for the Nuggets. What does his ceiling look like? The funny thing is that if you talk to scouts and other executives, his game ages so well, right? He has had no major injuries, barely gets off the ground, save your knees like that. And there's just kind of you could see him playing this game at a YMCA when he's 50, and he's still dominating people because it's not predicated on speed, it's not predicated on athleticism, it's predicated on processing. So what's his ceiling? I just think, his efficiency just keeps going up. That's the crazy part, and people don't know how to discuss him. Domantas Sabonis, he's Lithuanian. He I think is averaging Sacramento Kings center. He's averaging 7.5 assists per game. The second most of any center. Joker is averaging 10 assists a game, 2.5 more assists per game, and he's just on a different stratosphere. So I think the efficiency, I think if he had his druthers, he would score 20 points a game and call it a day, and maybe 15 assists. I don't know. I don't know what his ceiling is. What do you think?
Well, I'll jump in on concur that I don't know what his ceiling is, but what I'm really intrigued by the question reminds me of this curious fetish that sports culture, and particularly the language of basketball, has for upside. I think there's even like a blog called Ridiculous Upside, and in the sense that here's a person who has potential, and we're going to try to gauge how high, and then you're kind of monitoring the player against the expectation. And these are not just ephemeral observations. There's a lot of money that goes into that's like their bets. Are they going to live up to this role? Or if your son paid too much for it and they're not delivering at that level, it's like a disaster and so forth. And what strikes me about, so interesting to hear you ask the question, is that Jokic has existed without that. No one is ever talking about his ridiculous upside. Every layer of accretion in his talent and his accomplishment has been like, what? As you think he's been at his ceiling for after 6 weeks into here, you're just like, well, his ceiling is he can maybe block half a shot a game and be a backup center. Oh, what's happening with, I got him to tell me some really interesting stuff about the era when Nurkic and Jokic were on the team together and what the politics were, and I'll let him say that for his book, but it's super interesting. And so now it's like, oh, actually this dude could be a starter on this team. Isn't that amazing? And then he spent his entire professional life hovering at and then above the ceiling. And it never even occurred to me to kind of create that space. There's more. I'm like, I still am at the place. We're looking at a dude who might win an MVP again for the 3rd time, and it's less preposterous than the first time on the face of it. We have language to understand some of the things he does, the efficiencies, the shooting percentage.
That's interesting. The idea that he could go from an unknown 2nd-round pick to a one-time MVP, is that a bigger gap than a one-time MVP to a 3-time MVP? That to go from the 41st pick in the draft to win an MVP is astonishing. But now he set a precedent. We're like, okay, maybe he can do it. The second time, maybe third
In
time.
any other situation, I would say the gap between a nobody and an MVP is the hugest thing, and then the other MVPs. But it's the nature of Jokic, and maybe I'm eating my own, I'm high my own supply here, and I'm making too much of this.
Wasn't Giannis the same? Like, you never,
Right.
when he came in, it was like,
Right.
and
Yeah, but
every
pretty
time-
quickly with Giannis, he was doing
He just
things-
looks different.
He
You
was
see him
different.
and you go, oh my god.
He was doing
that
things
guy's
physically that were so shocking and remarkable, and like taking 2 steps, 2 dribbles inside the half court line and dunking on people, and
Right.
he was a superhero. He belonged to the superhero kind of Gumby superhero.
I think he is. That's the crazy thing.
But
He's just a different
there's no
superhero.
obvious but there's no the superhero, like they all have their special thing. It's
not sexy.
It's hard to define. What's the? Does he have a big hammer? Does he just throw lightning? Like, what is it? So
Didn't you
it's
say
very-
it was something Superman?
something to do with the
Yeah.
hands. Something to do with the hands and the way the ball comes off.
This is it was the soft Superman, is what we said, and it coordinated with the picture of him going like this. We did that on purpose.
Yeah. All right, guys, you're the best. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you guys.
See you next year.